Where have all the twin lens reflex cameras gone? In this edition of Jules Voto's Photo Focus, I'm going to look back at 1970, 1971 and talk about the twin lens reflex cameras that were available back then. And I'm going to use as my guide in this the 1971 Popular Photography Directory and Buying Guide. And I've used this before in some previous videos. Where have all the 35mm SLRs gone? And one on single lens reflex medium format cameras. But today we're going to talk about TLRs. But before I begin talking about the cameras from the early 70s, I just want to talk a little bit about TLRs, a little bit about their history and what they are. Now, I know a lot of us old timers know a lot about TLRs. We own some of them. I know I did back in the day. But it seems there's a lot of younger people watching my videos now and film shooters, 35mm film shooters, and they know about obviously 35mm SLRs and rangefinders, and they know about medium format SLRs, but I don't think a lot of people, younger people, know that much about TLRs. So I just want to talk a little bit about them before we get into the cameras of the early 70s. So for you old timers out there who know all about TLRs, might be a good time to go grab a cup of coffee and come back in a few minutes. So I have in front of me here the only twin lens reflex camera I still own. This is a Yashica 12. It dates from mid to late 60s. I picked it up a few years ago for like 80 bucks in a antique store, I think it was, back in Cape May, New Jersey. And why is a twin lens reflex called a twin lens reflex? Well, it's very simple. It has two lenses. It has a taking lens on the bottom, usually 80 or 75 millimeters. It has a viewing lens on top. And you view the image through usually a waist level finder, and behind the viewing lens is a mirror that reflects the image onto a ground glass. And they produce 2 1/4 square images on 120 or in some cases 220 film as well. There's a magnifier in here so you could precisely focus, focusing knob on the side. This is your basic TLR. Now the first TLRs were made by Rollei, and they came out in, I believe it was 1929. And through the years, Rollei was the most famous for their TLRs and produced many throughout the years. I think their production ended sometime in 1981. So what is the advantage of a TLR? Well, it has no moving mirror, so it's a very quiet camera. Now, let's take the lock off the shutter release. You could hardly hear it. Very quiet. They use leaf shutters. Most TLRs do not have interchangeable lenses, and there's no blackout. With an SLR, when you press the shutter release, the mirror flips up and you have blackout. With the TLR, you're always viewing the image. There's a couple disadvantages to most TLRs. One applies to all of them in that the taking lens is below the viewing lens. So you're seeing a slightly different view. We call that parallax. Okay? Because this lens is above, the viewing lens is above the taking lens. And it really doesn't matter much when you're shooting images at infinity or even closer. But when you get real close, and the minimum focus distance on this camera is 3 feet, and what happens is you're not seeing on the ground glass exactly what the bottom lens is seeing. Now, some of these cameras had parallax correction, which would give you a more proper view, but they're not really good for close-up photography, at least not these basic models. So that's basically what a TLR is. Most of them do not take interchangeable lenses. Okay, now let's get into the cameras of the early 70s. And we're going to start with Rolleiflex, who were the originators of the twin lens reflex. And their top of the line camera at that time was the 2.8F. They made several other models back then. And the 2.8F had a 2.8 80 millimeter Carl Zeiss planar as the taking lens. It also had a selenium meter, and you could see that just below the nameplate where it says Rolleiflex. It took interchangeable finders and screens. There was a prism finder available for it. There was a magnifying finder available for it. It took both 120 and 220 film. So on 120, you would get 12 exposure, 12 2¼ square exposures. On 220, you could obtain 24 2¼ square images. In 1972, I couldn't find a price in 70 or 71, but in 1972, it sold new for $580. Now, one of the other models of the Rolleiflex that was available, and this camera did not take interchangeable lenses, was the Rollei, and that had a 135 millimeter f4 sonar lens. It was a fixed 135 millimeter lens, so it was a good portrait camera. The Rolleiflex was made in Germany, was very well made, and were extremely popular. Some famous photographers in the 50s, 60s used the Rolleiflex. They were also popular with wedding photographers and studio photographers at that time. And the next camera we're going to talk about is one of the few TLRs that took interchangeable lenses, and that is the Mamiya C330. At the time, Mamiya made two interchangeable lens TLRs, the C220 and the C330. And the C330 is the one you see here. Mamiya interchangeable lens cameras date to, I believe, the mid-50s. And when you change lenses on the Mamiya, you were changing both lenses at the same time. And the normal taking lens for the Mamiya was an 80 millimeter 2.8. It had 7 interchangeable lenses available for it, ranging from 55 millimeters up to 250 millimeters. So you're buying these lenses as a set with the taking and viewing lens in one unit. One of the other great features besides interchangeable lenses on the Mamiya was a built-in bellows, which enabled you with the 80 millimeter lens to focus as close as 12 inches. Now, I talked about parallax earlier. The Mamiya had an accessory called a paramender. So you mounted the paramender to the tripod, mounted the camera on the paramender, and then you turned a knob on the paramender and it brought the viewing lens into the same position as the taking lens. So that was an invaluable accessory when doing close-up photography. It also, because of the bellows, you needed to compensate for the bellows. As you extended the bellows, the amount of light reaching the film dropped. So you needed to compensate for that. There was a little bar on the focusing screen that moved to indicate how much compensation you needed. Very well made, bigger and heavier than the Rolleiflex. It also had interchangeable finders and screens. There was a magnifying finder, there was a prism finder, there was a finder with a built-in meter. You focused with the Mamiya with one of the two knobs, one on the left side and one on the right side of the camera. I owned the Mamiya C330 back in the 70s and I was very pleased with it. I only had the 80 millimeter lens, but the lenses were sharp. It produced great quality negatives and transparencies. Next is a camera that also took interchangeable lenses. It's the Koni-Omegaflex M. And really didn't know much about this camera back then. I knew it existed, but never saw one. To this day, I have never seen one. Now, this camera didn't have as many interchangeable lenses available as the Mamiya. It had a 50, a standard 90 3.5, a 135, and 180 millimeter lens. It also had the finders and screens interchangeability, had a bellows, leaf shutters, as all these cameras did. I don't know if I mentioned that back when we were talking about the Rolleiflex, the Rolleiflex, the Mamiya, this one, and others, all had leaf shutters with speeds from 1 to 1/500th of a second, which meant they would sync with flash. That's one reason why they were popular with wedding photographers doing outdoor fill flash photography. So they would sync with electronic flash up to their top speed of 1/1/500th of a second, which was really nice to have. They also had, which none of these other cameras did, they had an interchangeable back, interchangeable magazines like the Hasselblad and the Bronicas and other medium format SLRs. It was big, it was heavy, and it sold for $500 with the 90 millimeter lens and a 120 magazine. And the lenses were made by Konica. They were hexagon lenses, which I know their 35 millimeter lenses were excellent, and I believe their medium format lenses were excellent as well. Next, we're going to talk about another TLR from a company that was famous for their 35 millimeter single lens reflex cameras, and that is Minolta, and the Minolta Autocord. The Minolta Autocord originated in 1955, and this particular model from the early 70s had a 75 millimeter 3.5 Rollei lens and a 3.2 viewing lens. It had a unique method of focus where the other cameras either had a knob on the side, or in the case of the Mamiya, had a knob on both sides. The Autocord had a lever at the bottom below the taking lens, and you just move that lever back and forth. You can just about see it in this picture here. It's marked in meters, and it focused down to 3 feet like most of these cameras without a bellows. It sold for $114 back in 1970, 1971. It's a camera I always wanted. Well, not back in the day, but going back maybe 5-10 years ago when I was looking to pick up a TLR, and eventually I got that Yashica, I was looking into some of these on eBay, and I could never find one in the condition or at the price that I thought was right. But again, Minolta made some excellent lenses, and it's a really nice camera, small, compact, and of course it had a leaf shutter as the others did. And finally is the Yashica 124, which was similar to the camera I showed you earlier, the Yashica 12, but the 124 took, in addition to 120 film, it also took 220 film. It also had a built-in CDS meter. If you look at the nameplate where it says Yashica, to the right of that, you see the window for the meter. It sold for $110 back then. It had an 80 millimeter 3.5 lens, and like the Minolta, it did not have interchangeable finders or screens. You just had the waist level finder. Now there was a 124G, which was the final Yashica TLR, and the only difference with the G, it had gold-plated electrical contacts, and it was all black. Focused to 3 feet like the others. It sold for $110. And if I remember right, when I got my Yashica, I believe it was maybe 74, it came with a case as well. And I believe I paid more than $110, but of course that was several years later than this publication. Now, one other thing I want to explain, and it's a feature of the Rolleiflex, the Yashica, and the Minolta, is in addition to the ground glass, which you could focus on, if you pressed on the front of the camera, press it all the way down, you had a frame viewfinder. Not the focus, but if you wanted to shoot some photos at a distance, you pre-focused or you focused on the ground glass, and then you could view through just a frame viewfinder. There's no optics in it. So it was a way, if you needed to shoot something at a distance, obviously it wouldn't work that great for close-ups. It wouldn't work well at all for close-ups. But it was another little feature that the TLRs had. Okay, so that is it for the twin lens reflex. There were many more in earlier times. By 1970, they were kind of on their way out, although the Mamiya was still popular, and the Rolleiflex, with wedding photographers, those who didn't want to put the money out for a single lens reflex. Now, when I worked for a wedding studio back in the 1990s, I had a Hasselblad 500 cm, and I only had one. So they would supply their photographers with a Mamiya C330 if they only had one camera, because you can't go to a wedding with one camera. Eventually, I picked up a Hasselblad 500C because I think it's much better to have two of the same camera when shooting a wedding especially. And of course, the Hasselblads had interchangeable backs, which I preferred for wedding photography. But the TLRs were around a long time. They were simple cameras compared to an SLR. You didn't have that moving mirror. As I showed you earlier, they were much quieter in operation. And I'm looking to pick up another one. I'm looking to possibly pick up a Mamiya C330. So if you have any questions or comments on this video, if you have experience with TLRs, please leave your comments, questions in the comments below. I always try to respond to all questions and comments. And I usually publish a new video every Monday morning and Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I will talk to you next time.